Hey everyone, my name is David from Line Studio, and today's tutorial will be the first in a series on how to make your own custom real-time Toon shader inside of Blender 2.8. And it will be in two parts. First, I want to show you a sneak peek of one of the characters that we made for Project Dinomancers, which will be a great way to demonstrate the kind of cool features that you can make inside the shader editor, especially as far as non-photorealistic rendering goes. And then I'll open up a new scene and we'll start making that shader from scratch, focusing on just one feature for now, which will be making a Toon shader that supports a 3-point lighting setup. And we'll do that using a cool little trick with the RGB channels. So there's a lot of things to cover. Hope you guys are ready, and let's get started. Okay, so welcome back. I've opened up my scene with one of our characters that's called Ballista, and he's badass. It fights with a big cannonball, and I'll use him to demonstrate some of the features that we've built on this custom shader. So if I go in the Material tab, you have this Ballista metal ball. And as you can see, there's a metallic effect here that I can toggle on and off that makes it more like a standard diffuse versus a metallic effect. And I can control the color of the lighted portion and the darker portion here. And it's using a matte cap material, which I've painted in Photoshop, so you can make it look anything you want. It renders super quickly. So all the pieces here are different materials. So the skin has a different material, and I can control how the light falls on this piece of skin. So let's say I want the edge of the skin here to be a bit smoother. I can go to key light color and change the edge, and it will become super soft. I can make it even softer if I want to. So it's very, very soft. And I can even control the size of the light here. So I can exaggerate how much the light influences my piece. So there's multiple lights in the scene right now. There's my key light, which affects the main direction of the light. And there's a fill light, which you can use to add a secondary light direction. But in my case, I'm using it here to have a separate cast shadow. So I can decide on what direction my light has for my character, and having my second light here that controls where the shadow falls on the ground, which can be super useful. And I have a third light that controls a 2D rim light. As you can see here, that's looks a bit like a Fresnel effect in the sense that it's there's some sort of a fixed width to it that looks more 2D, but it's being limited by what kind of shadows a real light would cast, so it looks more natural. And you can control obviously the size of this light. So if I go to my skin material, 2D rim light, I can control the size of it. I can even control I can cheat the direction so it comes a bit more from the top or from the side. So it's all pretty neat. What else? So there's an occlusion feature, which lets me control occlusion separately from material to material. So let's say I want to increase the occlusion on my skin here. I can increase the size of the occlusion. I can make it darker, or I could even make it more red if I want to like increase the subsurface scattering effect. Maybe that's a bit too much. And I can also make it sharper or softer depending on what I want. So it will sort of increase the contrast of the occlusion to look more stylized. So that's all pretty cool. I have an outline feature that lets me increase the size of my outline on my character. And I mean, there's so many things you can do. You can paint the textures directly inside Blender. And there's even a feature that we've made that lets you paint shadows. So what you see here, this little dark line underneath the belt, is actually a painted shadow that we've painted inside Blender, and it blends seamlessly with the shadow from my light. So you don't see the seam here. It's not darker right underneath the belt here. It just blends with the shadow but it's actually painted, and that lets you create a very specific 2D look, exactly like we wanted. So that's pretty nice. What we've really tried to do with this shader is make it super customizable, so you can make any kind of style you want, as long as you're making something that's sort of stylized, not photorealistic. So I hope you've enjoyed this little preview, and now I'm gonna close off the scene and open a fresh scene where I'll show you how to start making this shader from scratch. Okay, so I'm inside a new scene of Blender and we're ready to start making our shader from scratch. We don't really need any fancy objects for this, but I actually prefer using spheres than cube to see how lights react to stuff. So I'll just delete this here and press Shift A and create a new UV sphere. So I'll scale it up a bit, make it smooth, and make the viewport shading in rendered mode. So now we're ready to start. First thing we need to do is go to the material tab and create a new material here. So we can rename this however we want. I'll rename this Toon. And we now need to access the shader editor. And to do that, the way I like to do it is to go to the bottom here and drag the timeline upwards, and then press Shift F3 to access the shader editor. You can actually also do it just by going to the left here and clicking on shader editor. You can see the little shortcut Shift F3, but it's just, I like using shortcuts. So here you see the default shader that is being used on the sphere. It uses a principled BSDF, which is a bit too much for what we need. It has a lot of features, but for us, we really only need for the sphere to be able to capture a diffuse light. So I'll delete this and I'll create, sorry, I'll explain what I just did. So anytime you want to create a new node inside the shader editor, you can press Shift A like anywhere else in Blender. And then there's a little search tab here where you can type in whatever you want. So in my case, I want to diffuse BSDF. And I'll need two other things. First, I'll need a shader to RGB, and I'll need a color ramp. So why shader to RGB? Well, the thing is, the diffuse BSDF outputs something that's in like shader information. You can see it in green here. And what I need is color information in yellow so that I can plug it in my color ramp. So by placing it into my shader to RGB first, it transfers the information from the diffuse BSDF in a way that makes me able to use it in the color ramp. And once this is done, I'll just plug the color ramp inside the material output. And there you go. Now I can change the color ramp. And as you can see right away, I can create very sharp lighting effects on my sphere. So this is the very basic way to do a Toon shader. The problem, like you can really change this to any color you want, and there's ways to make this interesting as it is. The problem is once you want to start adding multiple lights, there really isn't any way to control the color of each of those lights and how much it affects the sphere. So we'll do it a bit differently. I'll start by just switching this back to black and white, and I will group this into a node group. So by selecting the three nodes here, I'll press Ctrl G, and it will all turn green, which means I'm inside the node group. You can toggle back and forth between the two by pressing Tab. So you can see here, this is the new node group. And what node groups are for is basically it's a way for you to reuse shaders across multiple materials so that if you decide to make any changes to this one shader, even if you have like 15 materials using them, you only need to change it once and it will update everywhere. And the other cool thing about node groups is that you can create parameters for your material that can be accessed on the right side of the screen here in the material tab, which is pretty useful because you don't need to go in the shader editor all the time. So I'll jump into my node group by pressing Tab, and we'll start creating some first parameter for material. So first thing we want is a way to control, let me just delete those lights here. It's awkward, so. Okay, so I just need one. All right, so I want a base color that will appear in the lighted section of my sphere. So I will start by pressing Shift A, and I will create a mix RGB node. So now I'll switch this to multiply and make sure to pump the factor to 1 here. So now I can plug my color from my color ramp in the first input here from my multiply. And I'll take this node here, this new node that has appeared since we've made the node group. It's called group input. And you see there's a little circle here. And whenever you drag this circle inside something, it will create a new parameter for your material. So in this case, you see it's created something that's called color 2. And I can change that color from the material tab here on the right. So this will be our base color, and I want to change the name to base color. So I'll go here in this little tab called node, and you see color 2. I can click on it, and I'll call this base color. So now it doesn't change anything because I haven't plugged my multiply node into my group output. So I'll do that just right now. And there you go. Now we're multiplying this color ramp, which is black and white, with our base color. So everything that's black will equal 0, so it will stay black. And everything that's white will equal 1, so it will show us the color that we've chosen. So now we need a new parameter to control what's in the black area of our sphere here. So in order to do that, we'll use a new mix RGB node. I'll duplicate it using Shift D. And I'll change the mode to lighten because I want to lighten the dark section here, but not touch the white section. So I'll just move this to the right, and I'll place the lighten node here in between the color ramp and the multiply. And I'll create a new parameter just like we did by clicking the little circle here from the group input and plug it into color 2. So it's created a new parameter here. You can see it here. I'll rename it shadow color. And so now I can control my shadow color. So as you can see, by default, it's going to be black. But if I make it white, there's going to be no shadow at all because it's going to lighten the black of my color ramp before it's being multiplied onto my base color. So I'll leave this maybe not black, but sort of a darker gray. So this is pretty cool. We have 2 parameters. The problem is that we still have the same issue as before, where if I duplicate my lights, I can't control the color of each of those lights. So we'll need to do things a bit differently. So the tricks that we'll be using is to use the RGB channels. So we'll have 3 lights. We'll have our key light that's going to use the red channel, and the other lights will use the green and the blue channels. And the reason we'll be doing it this way is because there's really no way that I know of for a shader to target a specific light and tell it use information or light information from this light in particular. But there's a way to separate the channels and tell it just use the red color and the blue color. So it's sort of a cheat that we'll be using that lets us use 3 lights, which in the case of Toon Shader is plenty enough because most times you want to light things using a key light, a backlight, and a fill light. So I actually don't want to use a point light here because as you can see, as you move it closer to your model and further away, it sort of changes how it looks. So I'll delete this and I'll create a new light, which is going to be a sunlight. And what's nice about sunlight is whatever I do with the position of it, it's never going to change. The only thing that's going to affect this is the rotation of my light. So that's great. I'll rename this key light R for red, and I'll change it to red. I'll go in the RGB tab here, make it 1 for red. I'll duplicate this, rotate it, and this one I'll call it fill light. G for green, and I'll duplicate this one again, and I'll call it backlight B for blue. I'll make it blue. All right, so right now I'll need to tell my shader to first only use the red channel for my key light. So I'll create a new node. I'll press Shift A for add, click on search, and I'm going to write separate RGB. So separate RGB node, what it does is it takes color information and you can sort of just use the specific channel that you want, which is exactly what we need right now. So I will plug it in between the shader to RGB and color ramp, and I'll just use the R channel. And make sure to, I did something here. So if you drop it in between the two, sometimes it won't update automatically. I don't know why, but you need to sort of disconnect this and reconnect the R. And as you can see, now it will only take the red color into account. So that's pretty nice. We have other lights, but it's not using them right now. So that's great. What we want to start doing is having a new parameter for each of those lights that will help us control the color of that light. So we'll make a new node, which is going to be a mix RGB, and we'll make it in the multiply mode, bump the factor to 1, and we'll go just in between the color ramp here and the lighten mode, and we'll place the multiply here, and I will duplicate the group input. And so just so you know, a group inputs, you can have as many as you want in this shader editor space, and it really doesn't change anything. It's really just to organize things better. Sometimes you don't want to have just one group input with lines that go all over the place because it becomes unreadable. So I like to duplicate my group inputs in places that make sense so that I can read the lines that connects my nodes. So I will take this new group input here, and I will drag this little circle here at the bottom to my color 2 from my new multiply node. And this time I'll call it key light color. So now I can change the color of my light here. And so you might wonder what the difference is at the moment between base color and key light color. And I admit right now there isn't really a big difference. But once we start adding textures to our model, we want to plug it into base color. And that way we can have a different color for the key light, which will be super useful. So already you can see that there's a lot of nodes and it's already starting to be a bit hard to remember where things are. So I'll show you a nice trick to keep things organized, and it's by using the layout frame here. So a frame is just a way to group things together. So I just took all my nodes, I dragged and dropped them into this frame here, and I'll rename this frame key light. So now I know that everything that's in there concerns my key light, and I want to make a group for my fill light, and I want to make a group for my backlight. So I'll make a new frame. I'll call it fill light, and I'll duplicate it and call it backlight. Okay, and now what I'll be doing is duplicating these 3 nodes that I've created here. I'll press Shift D, and they'll sort of be stuck into this frame. So what I want to do is press Alt P to unparent them, and I'll drag them into my fill light here, and afterwards I'll do the same and put them into my backlight. So click on all 3, Shift D, unclick, Alt P, and I put them into my backlight here. And so I have my 3 lights. And now I need to tell this fill light to use the green channel, and I need to tell my backlight to use the blue channel. Great. So there's really only one thing left here, is to composite this fill light and this backlight back onto my shader. So what we'll be doing is pretty simple. We'll make a new mix RGB that's going to be in add mode, and we'll put it in between the multiply and the group output here, make the factor 1, and afterwards we'll take the multiply node, the output of the multiply node here from our fill light, and we'll plug it in color 2 of our add node. So as you can see right away, there's this new light that's being comped over in additive mode, and we'll be able to control its light color by connecting. So this is something I haven't done yet. I need to connect my group input to this color 2 to create a new parameter. Same thing for my backlight. So now I have my new parameters here for each of those lights. I'll rename them fill light color and backlight color. So now if I want to control the color of this fill light here, I can make it a nice blue like this, and I can make this a nice gradient, so it's really more of a fill light, more of a subtle light, while this one could be a bit sharper. And if I want to add my last light, I'll just duplicate this add here and click here, and I'll connect this multiply node to color 2. And why is it not working? Oh, it's because I haven't connected my blue channel to my color ramp. I thought I did that already. So there you go. And I have my nice little backlight here. And something you can do if you don't want to have it super sharp is add some kind of glow using a new handle here. So I'll press this little plus button and make this a very dark gray, switch this to B-spline, and then you can have, let me show you, so you can okay, so you can have some kind of a gradient here, like a very sharp edge with a gradient. And if I want to make this pop a little bit, I can even pump the value to more than 1. So if I click on backlight color, I can make this value like 5, or maybe not 5, maybe 1.5. All right, so there's a bit of a glow here. And there you go. You have 3 lights. You can control their sharpness, the direction, and their color. And this will be the starting point for a shader, where we'll be adding more features over time in the next videos. So I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments. Please hit the like button if you liked it, and subscribe to our channel, and I'll see you next time.